Everybody is watching the headlines, waiting for one simple moment, a handshake, a signature, a declaration that peace has finally arrived between Washington and Tehran. The cameras are ready, diplomats are preparing statements, and many people around the world are hoping that another major conflict in the Middle East may finally be cooling down. But look a little deeper, guys. Step away from the official announcements for just a moment and ask yourself a much more uncomfortable question. If peace is truly approaching, then why is the region still preparing for war? That is where this story becomes much bigger than a single agreement between the United States and Iran. The real battle is not only happening inside conference rooms where diplomats exchange documents and make promises. The real battle is happening on the ground, in military calculations, economic strategies, and the long-term ambitions of countries that may not even be sitting at the negotiation table. And this is where it gets interesting. A peace agreement is only as strong as the people willing to respect it. Think about that. Two countries can sign the most beautiful document in history. They can announce a new beginning. They can celebrate a diplomatic victory. But if another powerful player continues acting according to its own security calculations and strategic interests, the entire foundation of that agreement can become unstable. This is one of the biggest challenges facing the current situation in the Middle East. Israel and Iran have been locked in a decades-long confrontation, directly and indirectly, through regional allies, military pressure, intelligence operations, and competing visions for the future of the region. Any attempt by Washington and Tehran to reduce tensions must operate inside this larger reality. Some analysts argue that even if the United States and Iran reach an understanding over nuclear issues or sanctions, the wider regional conflict involving groups like Hezbollah, as well as Israel's own security concerns, remains a separate and extremely difficult problem. Does that make sense? Because this is how geopolitics works. Countries do not simply switch off their strategic fears because diplomats are having a good week. Now think about the position of every major player involved. For Washington, avoiding another expensive military conflict in the Middle East has obvious advantages. America has spent decades managing crises across the region. Its military commitments, political resources, and financial costs have been enormous. A successful diplomatic breakthrough would allow American leadership to claim that negotiations achieved something that military pressure alone could not. For Iran, negotiations can also provide important benefits. Years of sanctions have created economic pressure on ordinary citizens and have affected different parts of the country's economy. A reduction in pressure could provide breathing space, improve trade opportunities, and reduce the immediate risk of a larger military confrontation. But here is the question that strategic analysts always ask. Is a pause in conflict the same thing as a permanent peace? The answer is not always. History is filled with moments when enemies temporarily reduced tensions because the circumstances demanded it, not because their fundamental disagreements disappeared. Sometimes countries negotiate because they need time. Sometimes they negotiate because their economy is suffering. Sometimes they negotiate because they believe waiting for a better strategic moment serves their interests. That does not automatically mean every agreement is fake or guaranteed to fail. International diplomacy is far more complicated than that. Many temporary agreements eventually develop into lasting arrangements. But it does mean that the intentions and actions of every side must be examined carefully. And this brings us to one of the most sensitive issues in the entire discussion: Iran's nuclear program. For years, the nuclear question has been at the center of the confrontation between Iran and Western countries. The United States and its allies have demanded stronger guarantees that Iran's nuclear activities remain peaceful, while Iranian officials have argued that their country has the right to develop nuclear technology under international frameworks. The disagreement is not only about technology, it is about trust. And in international politics, trust is one of the rarest resources in existence. Imagine two rivals standing across from each other after decades of confrontation. One side says, "Show us that you are willing to reduce your capabilities first, and then we will reward you." The other side responds, "Give us the economic relief and security guarantees first, and then we will make further concessions." Do you see the problem? Both sides are afraid of moving first because the first side to make a major concession risks losing its leverage. This is the classic security dilemma that appears again and again throughout history. Now, reports and intelligence assessments regarding Iranian nuclear facilities have added another layer of complexity to this debate. Some reports suggest that Iran has taken measures to strengthen protection around certain nuclear locations, which critics interpret as evidence that Tehran wants to preserve strategic options. Iranian authorities, however, have often argued that their nuclear infrastructure requires protection because of threats of military attacks. The interpretation depends heavily on which strategic lens you use, and that is exactly why these negotiations are so difficult. Every action has two different explanations. A defensive measure to one side can look like preparation for future confrontation to another side. A diplomatic compromise for one political faction can look like weakness or surrender to another faction. Now think about what is happening inside Iran itself. No government is a single voice. Different institutions, political groups, and power centers often have different ideas about how the country should deal with foreign pressure. Some factions may believe negotiations and economic recovery are necessary, while others may fear that too much compromise could weaken the country's long-term strategic position. This internal competition matters because international agreements are not only negotiations between countries, they are also negotiations inside countries. A diplomat may sign a document overseas, but political groups at home must still accept the consequences. And this is where many peace processes throughout history have faced their greatest challenges. The people shaking hands at the table are not always the people controlling every weapon, every institution, or every source of political influence behind the scenes. So the real question is not simply whether a deal will be signed. The real question is what happens the day after the cameras leave? What happens when military commanders evaluate the agreement? What happens when regional allies calculate whether the new situation helps or hurts their interests? What happens when domestic political opponents begin attacking the agreement from inside their own countries? That is when the true test begins. Because in geopolitics, the announcement of peace is often the easiest part. Maintaining peace is the real battle. Now look beyond the negotiating room and start looking at the wider chessboard. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make when analyzing Middle Eastern conflicts is believing they are only about two countries sitting across from each other. They are not. Every move creates reactions from regional powers, military organizations, economic actors, and global superpowers. This is important. A deal between Washington and Tehran may reduce one layer of tension, but it does not automatically erase decades of rivalry between Iran and Israel. It does not instantly change the calculations of groups that have built their entire existence around regional resistance or security concerns. And it certainly does not eliminate the deep mistrust that has accumulated over generations. Think about it. Imagine two rivals agree to stop fighting directly, but their allies, their military structures, and their strategic networks continue to view each other as existential threats. Is that truly peace? Or is it simply a different phase of the same struggle? That is the question many experts are asking. From Israel's perspective, its national security doctrine has always been built around preventing hostile forces from developing capabilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. Israeli leaders across different political backgrounds have repeatedly emphasized that they reserve the right to act independently when they believe a serious threat is emerging. Whether one agrees with that strategy or criticizes it, understanding this mindset is essential because international politics is not only about what countries say publicly, it is about what they believe they cannot afford to risk. And this creates a major strategic problem. If Washington negotiates an arrangement with Tehran, but another regional actor believes that agreement does not solve its security concerns, then the agreement exists under constant pressure. A single military incident can change everything. One strike, one assassination, one attack on a strategic target, one mistake in an already unstable environment. History has shown us that entire regions can move from diplomacy to escalation within days. Now here is where the story becomes even more complicated. Even if all sides genuinely want to avoid a full-scale war, they can still find themselves moving toward one. This is known as the security dilemma. Country A increases its military capabilities because it says it wants to defend itself. Country B sees that increase and believes it is preparation for aggression. So Country B responds by increasing its own military readiness. Country A sees this response as proof that its fears were justified. And suddenly, both sides are preparing for conflict, even if neither side originally wanted one. Does that make sense? This is one of the oldest patterns in international relations, and the Middle East has experienced this cycle many times. But let us move to the issue that could have consequences far beyond the region itself, the Strait of Hormuz. Many people hear this name during periods of crisis and then forget about it. They think it is just another narrow waterway somewhere in the Gulf. No, it is one of the most strategically important locations on the entire planet. A significant portion of the world's oil trade passes through this narrow passage. Energy from major Gulf producers travels through these waters before reaching consumers in Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world. Now think about what that means. A conflict in this small area does not remain a Middle Eastern problem. It becomes a global economic problem. Oil prices can react immediately to uncertainty. Shipping companies begin calculating higher risks. Insurance costs can increase. Governments begin worrying about energy security. Industries dependent on stable fuel supplies start preparing for potential disruptions. The most powerful weapon is not always the one that destroys something. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is uncertainty. Let me repeat that. Sometimes uncertainty is more damaging than actual closure. Because global markets hate one thing more than anything else: they hate not knowing what comes next. If shipping companies believe there is even a small chance that a route may become dangerous, they begin charging more money. Investors become cautious. Alternative supply chains become more attractive. Over time, small changes in behavior can reshape entire economic systems. And this connects to a much larger discussion about global power. For decades, the United States has benefited from a financial system where the US dollar has played the dominant role in international trade, especially energy markets. The relationship between oil-producing states, international banking systems, and the dollar has been one of the foundations of American economic influence. Now, some analysts argue that any long-term instability in global energy routes could accelerate conversations among countries seeking alternative payment systems or more diversified economic arrangements. However, we should be careful here. This does not mean the dollar suddenly collapses tomorrow. Global reserve currencies are supported by enormous financial networks, legal systems, economic strength, and trust built over decades. Major transformations happen slowly, very slowly. Empires do not disappear overnight. Global financial systems do not collapse because of a single crisis. But history teaches us another lesson. Large systems often appear permanent right until the moment they begin changing. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. It is not only about oil, it is about the credibility of international security guarantees. It is about whether major powers can continue protecting the global trade routes on which modern economies depend. Now, let's look at another side of this equation: the cost of modern warfare. One of the biggest changes in 21st century conflict is the rise of relatively cheap technologies that can challenge extremely expensive military systems. A small drone costing thousands of dollars can force a nation to use defense systems worth millions of dollars. A cyber attack launched by a small team can create damage that once required an entire military operation. A group with limited resources can create strategic headaches for a much wealthier opponent. This is changing military thinking across the world. For centuries, the assumption was simple: the richer and more powerful army would naturally dominate. Today, the equation is more complicated. Technology has created new forms of asymmetric competition, and every major military power is trying to adapt. The United States, China, Russia, Israel, Iran, and many others are studying the same question. How do you defend against threats that are cheap to create but expensive to stop? That challenge will shape future conflicts far beyond the Middle East. Now, let us return to the central question everyone is asking: can a diplomatic agreement actually survive? The honest answer is yes, it is possible. Many conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve eventually produced agreements that lasted for years or even decades. Sometimes exhaustion creates opportunities for diplomacy. Sometimes economic pressure forces leaders to make compromises they previously rejected. Political realities matter. The United States may want stability to avoid another prolonged conflict. Iran may seek economic relief and reduced isolation. Regional countries may prefer calm because instability threatens investment, trade, and development. These are powerful motivations. But, and this is the critical word, but successful diplomacy requires more than signatures. It requires enforcement. It requires trust. It requires political support inside each country. And it requires all major players to believe that maintaining peace benefits them more than returning to confrontation. That is an extremely difficult condition to achieve, because even after a document is signed, the deeper strategic questions remain. Who controls influence in the Middle East? How will regional military alliances evolve? What happens to Iran's nuclear capabilities over the long term? How will Israel respond to developments it considers dangerous? What role will America play as global power competition with countries like China continues to grow? These questions do not disappear with a ceremony. They simply move into the next chapter. And this is where we have to stop thinking like spectators watching a dramatic event on television. International politics is not a movie where the credits roll after the peace agreement is signed. The signing is often just the beginning of the next struggle. The real story begins when everyone goes home, when the cameras are turned off, when military commanders return to their headquarters, when politicians face their domestic opponents, when economic pressures return, when old enemies must decide whether they truly trust each other, or whether they are simply waiting for a better moment. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What are the actions telling us? Because in geopolitics, words can be designed for audiences. Statements can be crafted for television. Promises can be made for diplomatic advantage. But military preparations, economic decisions, and long-term strategic investments often reveal what governments believe the future may hold. And if you want to understand where this crisis is really heading, that is where you should keep your eyes. Now guys, after looking at all of these moving pieces, the nuclear negotiations, the regional rivalries, the energy routes, and the global economic consequences, we arrive at the most important realization of all. The biggest mistake in international politics is assuming that every conflict ends with a dramatic moment, a handshake, a signed document, a photograph with world leaders smiling in front of cameras. That is the image the public sees. But the reality of geopolitics is usually much more complicated. A peace agreement is not a magic switch that transforms enemies into friends overnight. It is simply a framework, a temporary structure built on the assumption that both sides will continue believing cooperation is more valuable than confrontation. The moment that calculation changes, the entire arrangement can start shaking. And this is why the weeks and months after any agreement may actually be more important than the agreement itself. Think about it. If Iran receives economic relief, what does it do with that breathing space? Does it focus primarily on rebuilding its economy and integrating more deeply into global markets? Or does it continue prioritizing strategic competition with its rivals? If the United States achieves a diplomatic breakthrough, does Washington maintain the political patience required to preserve the agreement when disagreements inevitably appear? If Israel believes certain threats remain unresolved, will it accept the new reality, or will it continue pursuing its own independent security strategy? These are not simple questions with simple answers. They are the questions that will determine whether the region moves toward a new balance or simply enters another cycle of confrontation. And here is where we need to understand something that history teaches again and again. Countries rarely abandon their core strategic interests because of one negotiation. The United States has spent decades trying to maintain influence in the Middle East, protect international shipping routes, and secure relationships with regional partners. Iran has spent decades building networks of influence and developing strategies designed to protect itself from external pressure. Israel has spent decades shaping its security doctrine around preventing threats before they become impossible to manage. These strategic foundations were built over generations. They do not disappear in a single weekend. Now, some observers argue that this is exactly why diplomacy is so difficult but also so necessary. The alternative to imperfect agreements may sometimes be a continuous cycle of escalation, where every side becomes less secure over time. Others believe that agreements without resolving the underlying strategic disputes simply delay a future crisis. Both perspectives contain important arguments. This is what makes international relations fascinating. There are no easy villains and heroes in the way movies present them. There are states pursuing their own interest, leaders balancing domestic and international pressures, military organizations preparing for worst-case scenarios, and ordinary civilians who often pay the highest price when calculations fail. Now think about the global consequences for a moment. The Middle East is not an isolated theater. A disruption in the region affects factories in Asia, energy prices in Europe, financial markets in North America, and supply chains everywhere. A tanker moving through a narrow waterway in the Gulf can influence the price of fuel thousands of miles away. A military decision made in Tehran, Jerusalem, or Washington can influence investors in Tokyo, Beijing, London, and New York. That is how interconnected the modern world has become. And this brings us back to the larger question of global power. For decades, the international system has operated with the United States as the dominant military and financial power. But the 21st century is witnessing a period of transition. New economic powers are rising, new technologies are changing warfare, and regional states are becoming more independent in their decision-making. Does that mean American influence disappears tomorrow? Absolutely not. History does not move like that. Great powers often maintain enormous influence even as the international system changes around them. However, every major challenge, from economic competition to regional conflicts, tests the strength and adaptability of that system. The Middle East has always been one of the places where these tests become most visible. And this current crisis is another example of that larger transformation. Now, here is something that everyone should watch very carefully in the coming months. Do not only listen to official statements, watch the actions. Watch military deployments, watch economic decisions, watch whether sanctions are actually lifted or whether new restrictions appear. Watch whether regional groups reduce their military activity or continue preparing for future confrontations. Watch how energy markets respond, because those actions will tell us much more than political speeches. A government can announce peace while quietly preparing for conflict. A government can publicly use aggressive language while privately searching for compromise. That contradiction has existed throughout human history. Words are part of diplomacy. Actions are often the language of strategy, and this is where the future becomes uncertain. One possible scenario is that both sides recognize the enormous cost of another war and slowly build a more stable relationship through limited agreements and confidence-building measures. A second scenario is that the agreement survives temporarily but remains fragile, with repeated crises, accusations, and moments where the entire arrangement appears ready to collapse. A third possibility is that one major incident, whether a military strike, an attack by a regional actor, or a political shift inside one of the countries, destroys the diplomatic progress completely and returns the region to open confrontation. Nobody can predict with certainty which path will happen. Anyone who tells you they know the future of the Middle East with complete confidence is probably oversimplifying one of the most complex strategic environments on Earth. But we can analyze incentives, we can study history, we can examine military and economic realities, and we can ask the right questions. That is how you understand geopolitics. Not by following every dramatic headline, not by celebrating every announcement as the beginning of a new era, and not by assuming every negotiation is destined to fail. You look beneath the surface. You ask who gains. You ask who loses. You ask whether the fundamental fears that created the conflict have actually been resolved. Because the truth is, a signed document may end one chapter, but it does not necessarily end the story. The cameras will leave. The journalists will move on to the next breaking headline. The world will celebrate or criticize whatever agreement emerges. But behind closed doors, generals will continue planning. Intelligence agencies will continue gathering information. Governments will continue calculating risks. Economic powers will continue preparing for uncertainty. And ordinary people across the region will continue hoping that the decisions made by leaders do not lead to another devastating conflict. So the real question is not simply whether an agreement is announced. The real question is what happens when the excitement disappears. What happens after the celebrations? What happens after the headlines change? Because that is the moment when we discover whether this was the beginning of a genuine transformation or simply a temporary pause in a much longer geopolitical struggle. And that, guys, is the question the entire world should be watching very closely in the months ahead.